Hey folks, David Stewart here. I am an author. This is a video on new author pitfalls. Before I tell you the pitfalls, I'm going to tell you to buy this book, Eternal Dream Christmas. It has 10 Eternal Dream books, the first 10 chronologically. All the Eternal Dream books so far, minus the Moonsong series, which takes place like way later anyway. This is the main sequence of a lot of my fantasy books. It includes The Bright Children, which has never been in print before. It takes place in the mythic past of some of my already kind of well-known books, Water of Awakening and Needle Ash. So check that out. It's only available through January of 2025, and then it'll be gone. So if you want to get this massive volume, 600 pages, and quite big, bigger than my head, this will be your chance to do it. Or you can buy the ebook for $9.99. That's also a big value. So please check that out. So new author pitfalls. If people are kind of new to this, they want to be a writer, they want to be an author, there's a couple of easy mistakes to make. I've made them. Lots of other authors have made them. Not necessarily all 10, but chances are you may have fallen into one of these. The first one is they don't work consistently. This is why I wrote Keys to Prolific Creativity, which is over here, and patrons. But all patrons get this, by the way. So if you join my Patreon, you get this. This month's Patreon book, before I forget, is Afterglow Generation Y. So that's my literary fiction book. Anyway, they don't work consistently. I wrote Keys to Prolific Creativity because I realized the bigger problem with writing was not technique, that is like not knowing how to structure a plot or not knowing how to write characters, but just people not working. They weren't consistently working on their product. They weren't consistently writing in order to finish a book. So developing good writing habits is the most important thing, developing good work habits. So you got to be sitting down and do it every day. That's what I say. Okay. And the easiest way to get better is to practice. And in order to practice, you just need to do it every day. Develop a habit of doing it. So that's way more important than studying storytelling techniques. You can do that too, and that's also good. But the main thing is you have to put them into practice by actually doing it. So that's number one. Number two is new authors do not realize that they will suck. As Brian Niemeyer, who I've had on the show numerous times, has said, you have to get the suck out. You got to write like 1,000,000 words in order to not suck at being a writer. So having that consistent work ethic will help you to not suck as a writer. But a lot of people don't realize how bad they're going to be when they first start out. This is why a lot of people, when they come back and look at their earlier stuff, they're like really shocked at how bad it is, because as you progress as a writer, you also gain the ability to better judge your own writing and writing in general. So that's a big one. They don't realize that they're going to suck. You have to think that like a toddler doesn't start walking very well, right? He has to put some effort into it. He falls down. And that's something that we do all the time. That's a really basic motion. Think about how much harder it's going to be for you to learn how to write. So the first time you do something, it's going to be bad. Just accept it and love being in the phase where you are developing as a writer, where you're getting better all the time. Because when I go back and I look at even my worst stuff from when I started, I see the good things in it. I see, man, this was a dynamite idea. This joke is really funny. I see a lot of stuff that's great about it. I also see the stuff that's bad that wasn't necessarily apparent when I first started, and that's okay. It's okay to suck. You have permission to fail and to not be good when you first start, and just know that you're going to get better with practice. Number three is they overspend. This really has to do with authors who are getting into the independent publishing space, or authors who get duped into things like vanity publishing, where they're paying a vanity publisher to put their book out on their behalf, which you should never do. I have videos on why you shouldn't do that. But they get into the independent space and they haven't been doing it a long time, so they spend a lot of money. They hire an editor. The editor maybe doesn't know what to do with the book because it's really bad, so it's hard to edit it. They spend a lot of money on a cover. They try to throw a bunch of money at marketing. They hire a marketing firm and spend a lot of money to try to get their book to market and get in front of people's eyes and get people to buy it. They don't realize how hard it is to sell 1,000 copies. And so that is actually a big milestone for any book, is to be able to sell 1,000 copies. That's a lot, and it's a lot harder than you think. So they spend a lot on their first book and they don't recoup it, and then they end up in a bad place where they feel like they flushed all their money down the toilet on like some sort of ego project, and they don't know how they're going to make it back, and maybe they give it up. So the truth is, with your first book, you kind of like how you don't know that you suck. You don't really know the business, and that's okay. You haven't developed enough as a writer to know that your book isn't written to market. Maybe you haven't developed enough as a marketer to know that your book isn't going to sell well, or how well it's going to sell, or how to do ads and things like that. So it's better to keep your costs really low, especially for your early releases, and kind of test the market, learn how these things work, learn how ads work, learn what a good cover is, and how to improve your covers and things like that. Learn all of these things by doing them, and don't drop a lot of money, and save that money for when you have a much bigger mastery over what you're doing. You also have a better idea of like how to budget for these things. How much is a cover really worth? Really depends on what kind of market you're writing for. So number 4 is they write too much. I don't mean they write too often, because problem number 1 is they don't write often enough. They don't do the work often enough. But number 4 is they write too much. That is, new writers tend to write a lot of superfluous details. They write a lot of extra dialogue that doesn't function in the story. It doesn't tell the reader anything important. It doesn't improve characterization. It doesn't move the plot forward, and it doesn't describe the setting. It's maybe just characters bantering or things like that. Or they focus on details that just don't matter for the overall story. That's really common with fantasy and science fiction writers. They tend to just go off about their setting that they've imagined, their wonderful imaginary creative world. I have one. It's in the Eternal Dream Christmas book. They write paragraphs and paragraphs, pages on maybe the monetary system. The monetary system doesn't matter for your little invented world, right? Trading gold coins is good enough. That's been money for all of human history, so that works just fine. The truth is, you should talk about the setting elements that matter to the plot, and you have to learn how to talk about them correctly in context in a way that doesn't bore the reader. So they just write too much. They write too much superfluous detail. And one of the things, as you gain experience, is you figure out what not to write, and as you gain experience in editing, you figure out what to cut out. That we're going to remove things that are superfluous to the story until we're left with just the things that are functional for the setting, the characters, and the plot, for getting the story out there. Yeah, you can have some flavor. I have plenty of hoop-de-doodle in my books and lots of flavor, but I try to think of every scene like, is this scene going to be, where's it moving forward? What's it telling to the reader, and why does that matter? So that's a big one. Number 5 is they are not focused on the market enough. That is, and it's fine. It's actually a good thing. You want your first projects to really be passion projects, be things that you want to exist, because chances are you're not going to be able to finish them unless you really care about them existing. So they, new writers, they tend to not think about the market. They tend to not think about what readers want to read, and instead think about what they want to write. They don't think about what genres are popular or oversaturated, or unpopular, undersaturated, and they don't know what different market segments want. And so your first books that you write are probably going to be kind of misfires. Like one of the first books I published was a samurai book, and one of the reasons I self-published it is I had some good feedback from like agents that were like, this genre doesn't exist. It's not a genre. And I'm like, oh, well, I thought it was, but now that you think about it, I've only read like 2 books that were in it, and one of them was like really old. It's like, so okay, yeah, it's not a genre. I'm just gonna have to put it out. Now, there was an audience for it. There was a very strong kind of niche audience for Muramasa Blood Drinker, but I just didn't have a grasp on what like market segments wanted, or what kind of tropes different segments wanted. So I didn't know how to write to market at all. So that's really typical for new writers. Don't feel bad about it, and it's okay. Number 6 would be they're too focused on the market, right? So some people get really excited about, I'm going to write to market and make money, and so they start to write a book that fits every checkbox. They're like, okay, I'm going to write something in this military science fiction thing, and they hit every checkbox for what all the books in that genre do. And so what do you end up writing? You end up writing bland, generic slop that no one wants to read. There's nothing unique about it. So while you look at the market, you also need to think about what is unique and what's different about your book, and why it would appeal to people who already like some of those tropes, but will deliver them hopefully a new experience. So the old, that old chestnut of saying things are same but different, it really works to sell a lot of books. So you could say it's this but that, or this with that. Then it actually is able to put the marketing and what's unique about what you're doing together. I sold a lot of copies of Voices of the Void by saying it's Aliens meets Lovecraft. And every time I say that, I'm like, it's aliens meets Lovecraft. I'm like, it's a super cheesy thing to say, but people hear it and they're like, well, I want to read that. That sounds cool. That sounds like exactly something that would be interesting to me. And it works. I sold a lot of copies of that book with that simple line, aliens meets Lovecraft. So you don't have to spend your time agonizing over this stuff. A lot of new authors get excited by the idea of success, which they imagine in their head, so they start writing like Save the Cat, Blake Snyder style stuff, which is just going to be bland and generic. So you have to find something unique and interesting to do in the market as well. Number 7 is they're too focused on style rather than substance. What I mean by style is I mean sort of the way the sentences are written at the micro level, the words that you use, the way you throw sentences together, the way you describe things. They get too focused on that, and they don't think about the big picture, which is the setting, the characters, and the plot, which is really what sells a book. I can think of numerous books, and I'm sure you can too, that are stylistically not complex, interesting, or even good, yet they sold a lot of copies because the core story elements were compelling enough that people were willing to either get through bad style, or the bad style just didn't even matter to them. Something like Hunger Games, I think, has it's not a style that I enjoy, right? As that weird present tense style or whatever that it's written in. But people were okay with that, and it was capable of communicating to people the core story elements, and therefore they were able to enjoy the story, and it was a giant hit, right? So the bigger stuff, you have to do that as well. And I think maybe this comes from a lot of literary types, a lot of people that are literature majors or creative writing majors. A lot of the focus in those classes tends to be the way that the Steinbeck or someone writes Hoop-de-Doodle, the way he writes descriptions. And so that's what people focus on rather than like the way the book is constructed structurally. So they get too focused on style rather than substance. And let me tell you, like, a well-designed plot is going to beat purple prose no matter how beautiful every day of the week. So if the prose doesn't connect to a good story, people aren't going to sit through it. Number 8 is they focus on the big picture rather than the style. So it's just the inverse. They think, okay, as long as I have good characters and I have like a cool plot, then like none of that other little stuff matters. It's like, no, it does matter. Your dialogue needs to be sharp. It doesn't need to be Shakespeare. In fact, Shakespeare would probably be bad in a modern market. It doesn't need to be razor sharp, super good dialogue, but it does need to function for the story. So you do need to make it good enough to communicate your ideas. Same thing with prose. Prose doesn't have to be beautiful, flowery, wonderful, memorable prose. It just needs to be able to accurately and clearly communicate what's happening, actions that happen, what maybe characters are thinking, and what is necessary to understand like the environment of where a scene is taking place. In other words, what describing things, people, and things. It needs to be accurate enough that people are going to remember it. So you do have to have your micro down a little bit. So that's the other thing that I think just develops with practice. If you really want to get good at writing prose and dialogue, you just need to practice it a lot. So that's okay. That's a really common pitfall, is to focus on like the story elements that I talk about on the channel a lot, like this kind of character archetype, and just not worry about whether your dialogue sounds good and your prose is well written. You have to worry about that a little bit as well. Number 9 is endless editing. So this is kind of the inverse of like not realizing that you suck, is you think you suck worse than you do. There's authors who have been revising their first book for 5-10 years, and they'll say this like it's something to be proud of, and I don't think it is. I think if you're revising, if you're doing more than like 2 drafts on a book, you've gone horribly wrong somewhere, and you need to probably not try to continue editing that book. It may have just been part of that million words of suck that you have to write in order to get good, and put it to the side and write something new. And that's usually what I recommend to a lot of new writers, is like, take that book that you wrote. This one doesn't suck. This one's good. You should buy it. Eternal Dream Christmas. Only available through the end of January 2025. Take that book that you wrote, put it in a drawer, and come back to it next year. Go write something brand new from scratch. Don't worry about trying to edit and revise that first book. You need to gain skill. You need to gain skill through practice, and you're not going to be able to accurately revise that book anyway until you gain a little bit more perspective and skill, and some distance from the manuscript where you start to forget what you meant when you wrote it, and you are able to look at what you actually wrote and see if it's communicating anything to you. Then you can more accurately revise your prose and your dialogue to just be better, right? To just be better. So this is a really common thing, is to just keep revising that thing endlessly into the ground, rewriting it, cutting this, adding this back in. And I've talked to experienced screenwriters that are like, I know when I'm adding something back in that I cut out, that I've missed the ball somewhere and I need to take a step back and do another project. A lot of times authors will say that they have this character flaw of perfectionism. I talk about this in the book. Most people are not perfectionists. What they are is they're afraid of negative judgment. They're afraid of somebody saying that their book sucks. Let me tell you, it's going to happen. You're going to get a 1-star review, and you're just going to have to learn how to live with that 1-star review. I've had 1-star reviews, and you're just going to have to learn to deal with that. So embrace the growth phase and work on new projects. And if you're really worried about editing, then after you have built up your skills a little bit and cleaned up your original work, maybe think about hiring an editor, an outside voice who can actually tell you what might be wrong or what might not be wrong and what might be good about your book, rather than constantly tearing your hair out worried about whether it's good enough. That would be a better approach to editing than just endlessly revising your work for years and years on end. Don't endlessly revise your first book. Write more books and then come back and try to revise that first book. That's what Moonsong, The City of Silver, those books, those were some of the first books I wrote. I put them in the drawer. I wrote other books. I came back to them. I heavily revised them and made them way, way better, having gained all of the skills that I gained through practice. So I'm taking my own advice on that one, and I'm giving you that advice. Number 10, this is a big one. They don't read. This is bad enough that Stephen King talks about it in On Writing, his little memoir of the craft, his little writing manual, is that there's so many writers who don't take the time to read books. You need to be reading books. And if you say, I don't have time to read books, then you don't have time to write. I think the Stephen King quote is, if you don't read, then you won't have the time or the tools to write. Because when you're reading, you're picking up what that other author has done. You could pick up what I've done by picking up The Eternal Dream Christmas. You're seeing how he constructed the sentences, how he wrote the prose, how he wrote the dialogue for the characters, what he named the characters, how the book is structured. All that stuff comes into play when you are reading a book, and that's going to give you ideas and perspective and understanding for how to do all of those things in your book, especially as you develop your own voice. Having those extra inputs, those extra ideas, those extra little bits of inspiration are going to help you really to hone your style well. So you need to be reading. In my opinion, audiobooks are good. I listen to audiobooks. Someone's going to bring up audiobooks. But I think you also need to read words on a page. Words on a page come out differently and enter your brain in a different space than merely listening to books. You can do both, but I don't think you should look at audiobooks as a sufficient substitute for reading words written on a page. And I also feel like they look different on a physical page versus a device. I read a lot in the margins. So you have a phone, you have a Kindle app, you can read a lot of ebooks in the margins. When you have a little downtime, when you have 5 minutes, instead of looking at social media, read a book, right? I read a lot of articles. I read articles written by my friends. I read articles online. So I'm reading a lot of nonfiction stuff all the time too, which is important because I write a lot of nonfiction. So all of the stuff that I do, I'm trying to see what other people are doing with it. So I prefer long stretches with a physical book. I don't always have time for that, but I am able to listen to a few minutes of an audiobook while doing the dishes. I am able to read a couple pages of an ebook in between different tasks, like, transitioning my kids off of the playground and back inside or something like that. So I have a lot of those little times where the device is really useful for packing in some extra reading. And I still will do my best to make a little bit of time to just have a physical book and sit in the quiet and read. But it's not always there. Sometimes I have to do something else. So read. Make sure you are reading, because that's going to give you the inspiration, the tools, all kinds of good input that you need in order to craft better books and make your practice more productive as you try to implement the things that other artists have done, or use them as inspiration for your own unique take on what other artists have done. So anyway, check that out. Do buy The Eternal Dream Christmas. Patrons get Afterglow Generation Y for the month of December, and everybody who's a patron gets Keys to Prolific Creativity. So I will see you all next time, and have a great, great day. Leave me your thoughts down below. What are some other new author pitfalls or old author pitfalls I wonder what some old ones are. I got to think about, I'm an old author, so I should have, what are my pitfalls? Anyway, have a great one. I'll see you next time.